Studio One's Mojito. This is a basic subtractive synthesizer that comes with Studio One. And if you're using a different version of Studio One 3, this is going to be the same if you're interested in learning this device. And this is something to work with if you're new to synthesis, and if you're watching this video, you probably are. So the format of this video, I'm actually going to cover a few concepts of synthesis while we're going through this. Now the Mojito is geared for producing bass sounds, leads, and effects. And there are 4 different areas within Mojito. We have our oscillator, filter, effects, and an amp section. Now, as with all of my tutorials, we're going to cover every parameter within the device, and starting from the top, we'll make our way down. We have power for on and off. We have bypass. We have an area here for storing presets, replacing, and so on. Choosing our patches, we can do that here. But for now, I'm just going to use the default patch because we're going to go through and adjust some of these parameters. We've got a section for automation, and that is beyond the scope of this video. I do have a couple of videos up on using automation within Studio One, so you should see a little link up here to check those out if you'd like. We can also navigate through our patches with these left and right arrows. Now we've got a compare button here, so if you've made some tweaks and want to go back to where you were before, you can use that. If you have another instance of Mojito open, you can copy the settings here that you've adjusted, and if you'd like to use them in another instance, go to that second or other Mojito, and then you can use the paste to paste those settings there. Next we have a gear icon, and this is for setting up control of this device with an external MIDI controller. And again, that's a bit beyond this video, but very briefly, if I would like to say control the cutoff here, then I would turn this dial. You can see the display changes to filter cutoff. I'll then turn, say, number 4 knob on my controller. You can see that this is updated and we're having a readout of the adjustments that I'm making to the knob. I can then click this link button, and now I can then control the filter cutoff with my external controller. Now if you're using Studio One 3, you're not going to see this link here, you're just going to see an arrow, but that will accomplish the same thing. And I'm actually going to just unlink that. And also I think I'll get rid of these displays for now. So starting here with the oscillator, we've got pitch control, and this is going to adjust 1 octave up or 1 octave down. We don't have a display here when we're adjusting, but if we look at the display parameter display window here, we can see we've got negative 12 cents here. If I just bring this all the way down, then you can see we've got 1 octave down, 1 octave up. So I'll control click to return that back to as it was. We next have a dial for wave. This basically adjusts or moves between a sawtooth wave and a pulse wave or a square wave. The width is going to adjust the size or the width of the square wave. And actually, let's take a look at what that looks like. But first we'll go through and listen to this wave, how when we adjust between the sawtooth and the square. And that's actually a bit low because the filter cutoff has been turned down. And so this width is then going to control the width of this. Now that we're on this square, it's going to control the width of that square. And keep in mind that this width is only going to adjust the square. If we're on the sawtooth, it's not going to make any adjustments to that. Now if I F3 and bring up the console, I've got a scope attached to this, so we can actually see what these look like to give you a better idea and understanding of how this works. So if I come to the sawtooth, we can see that there. Now as I move to the square, then we can see how the width adjusts that. Next, we've got a section here for our LFO speed, which we can use to adjust these three parameters here. So we can choose between tempo, which is going to sync to your song tempo. We can also use hertz, and then use the dial below here to adjust. We can also click on this display and then choose a value from that menu. So if we would like to introduce some modulation to one of these parameters, let's say the pitch, we then would use these dials below. So moving to the left or right is basically going to adjust the polarity of our modulation. Now, in the end here, we have a sub oscillator, and this is just basically going to introduce more lower frequencies into our audio. And you can even see our scope here. There's almost a sine wave being introduced. And then for now, I think I'll go ahead and close out the scope and move this back, and let's close out our mixer by hitting F3. Now below the oscillator section, we have our Portamento settings. By default, it's on legato. So if I press a key and while holding that key, press another one, we're going to get kind of a smooth transition between those two. And we can adjust the time of that transition using this dial here. Now we have a couple of different settings that we can choose from within this area. We can choose off, so if I press a key and hold and then press another one, it's just going to cut the first note off. Now if I choose Retrigger, we're still going to get that Portamento, that glide, but it's also going to retrigger our envelope settings here. So you can see we're still getting that short attack even when we change to the next note while we're holding down the original. If I were to increase the attack time, now if I come back to legato, see our ADSR is not going to play a part when legato is selected, only with Retrigger. Next we've got our amp section, and of course this is just going to adjust the overall gain of our Mojito. We have a velocity section. This is basically controls the velocity sensitivity of the device. So as it is in the center here, each key that I press is going to be one velocity. There is, let me bring the attack back down. There is no variation no matter how hard or soft that I press a key on the keyboard. If I come all the way to the right, we're going to have full velocity sensitivity. So then depending on the velocity information, we'll get harder or softer notes. To the left. the softer I play, the louder it's going to be. The harder I play, the softer. So this is as soft as I can play on my keyboard controller. Now this is about as hard as I can play. So I'll go ahead and control click to put that back. Moving on, we're back to our ADSR and our attack, decay, sustain, and release. Again, I'm assuming that if you're watching this, then you're new to synthesis, so I'll briefly go over this really quick. The attack is basically going to control how quickly we reach our full amplitude. So with this low attack, we'll immediately play full amplitude. The decay then controls the amount of time that we drop in volume to our sustained volume while we're holding the key down. Then the release determines how quickly we drop down to silence from sustain after we release our key. So we have an immediate attack right now. If I raise this up, you see we have a gradual introduction to that full amplitude. Now as we're adjusting these, we don't have a readout as to what the time is, but we can look in the parameter display window, and then we can see that that's 274 milliseconds until we reach full amplitude. If we're down at the bottom, it's 2 milliseconds. We could also click our gear icon and see that information here as well. So let's have an immediate attack, our decay, which is going to be the amount of time it drops from full amplitude to our sustain level, and that's going to be 1 second. And our sustain, which is the volume after we've reached full amplitude and it comes down to our sustain while we hold the key, is at minus 12 dB. I can raise this all the way up to unity or 0 dB and have that same volume that we have when we have the initial attack. Or I could lower it. Now we have an immediate release of 2 milliseconds. I could raise this up, so then now when I release the key on the keyboard, we're going to have a slower drop off of our sound. Now you can't see my keyboard, but if you take note to the MIDI meter here, you can see there's a second. When it happens a second time, that's when I'm releasing, and you can hear how much this adds on, and you can see here 2 seconds after that second meter display. So that's the trigger, release, and that's our 2 seconds that we've added. So I will control click and return these to their default positions, and let's move on to the cutoff section here. So with the filter cutoff section, we can control which frequencies are going to be heard when we're playing back our audio. By default, the range here is 16 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz, and by default we can get that full range of sound. As I move this here, you can take note again in this parameter display window, we're at 16 kilohertz. As we move to the left, we drop down. At this setting here, for instance, we're at 326 hertz. So that is where we're cutting, and everything below at 326 and below will hear. As I come back up to the right, more frequencies are introduced. Now we also have a this reso, which is resonance. We can kind of increase the frequency, the cutoff frequency. So if we're at 6K, we can raise the gain around that 6K to kind of emphasize that cutoff frequency. Now if I move this cutoff frequency down while we have the resonance turned up, we can hear we kind of sweep through those frequencies. So I'll go ahead and take that back down. Now we have a drive here. We've got key, and by default this is turned all the way at 100%. And basically what this does is, if you think about a traditional piano, as you play lower, the frequencies are going to kind of become a bit more dulled. As you play the higher keys, you get a lot more higher frequencies. This setting of 100% basically introduces that same sort of performance to the Mojito. So if I play higher keys, then we have a brighter sound. If I come down and play lower, we've got a bit duller, less higher frequency information. Now that's what that controls. If I take this all the way down, you see we get our higher frequencies again. Come back up, and they're gone. So even if I come back up, we've got our high frequencies there. So I'll control click and put that back to 100% as it is with default. Next we have velocity, and this basically allows you to control how hard or soft you're playing on your external controller is going to influence the cutoff frequencies. Now by default this is set to 0%, but as we move to the left, harder velocity cuts and lower velocity will allow higher frequencies to come through. If we move to the right, then harder velocities will allow higher frequencies through, and playing softer will cut the frequencies. So if I raise this cutoff here, so I'm triggering pretty hard on the key here, and we have a duller sound. As I play lighter, the higher frequencies are allowed to come through. Now if I come to the right, the harder I play, the higher frequencies are allowed through. And then it becomes duller the softer I play. Moving on to the envelope here, this is going to allow you to control how your cutoff frequency is affected by the ADSR settings. And as it's set up, we have an immediate attack. So what we have set here is going to be heard immediately. If I move to the left, then we cut frequencies, and it's an immediate cut because our attack is down here. If I raise this up, you see we have half a second until we have a cut going on. If I take our cutoff down, you can see that moving to the right, we start with our initial cutoff around 760 Hertz, and then we introduce higher frequencies after our attack high setting of half a second. Now we also have an LFO section here, just as with the oscillator, to control our filter cutoff. And with this, we can introduce some of that modulation to our frequency cutoff. We have a section here where we can control the speed. And if I, moving to the left or right, again, is kind of a polarity adjustment. So in the center, we don't have any modulation. If I come to the left, and then I can adjust that speed by coming here. And so that's what that's for. And finally below we have an effects section. Here we can introduce color. The depth is going to determine how much of this modulation that we're introducing and how much color. It's going to kind of change the timbre of the sound here. So and then we have a drive. And actually, for fun, let's just take a look at what that looks like visually on our scope and see what the waveform is doing here. So I'll take the depth down, take the drive down. And you can actually see how our cutoff affects that waveform. And we've got a sine here, basically. Let's introduce some of this color. And you can see that modulation happening, and keep in mind that that's going to be affected by our LFO speed. So if I change this, okay, so that is working with the Mojito.